Szanowni Państwo, dzień dobry, witam. Ja nazywam się Marcin Maryl i jest niezwykle przyjemnie widzieć w jednym miejscu zebranych tylu ekspertów, osoby zainteresowane mieszkalnictwem. Będziemy przez 2 dni rozmawiać dokładnie o tym, co dotyczy nas wszystkich, co jest podstawą wszystkich dalszych części życia, czyli mieszkalnictwie. A do otwarcia naszego forum zapraszam dyrektorkę krajową Rishanę Hanifę, wiceprezydenta Habitat for Humanity International Ricka Hathawaya i dyrektorkę do spraw rzecznictwa Katarzynę Przybylską.
Dzień dobry. Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased and honored to welcome all of you to this year's Housing Forum. As you know, we have been holding this Housing Forum for the past 8 years. I want to especially acknowledge and welcome the presence of representatives of national and local governments, representatives of ministries and local authorities, representatives of the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, and the International Organization for Migration, IOM, colleagues from the business sector, NGOs, INGOs, academia, and housing experts. I want to especially thank colleagues who have traveled to Warsaw from other countries and cities to join this year's forum. In addition to all of us, we also have an audience who join us. It's extremely gratifying for all of us that we have managed to get one speakers and experts housing in Poland, one of the most critical global issues today. Homelessness, housing and settlements, housing discrimination, evictions, climate change are all key issues that the world is grappling with, including in Poland. These issues are complex and interconnected with broader national and global social, economic, and political factors. Addressing these issues often requires a multifaceted approach involving governments, civil society, and the private sector to ensure access to safe, affordable, and adequate housing for all. I do hope this year's forum will significantly contribute towards the ongoing initiatives in Poland to address the housing crisis. Thank you.
I'd like to begin by thanking the organization in Poland for their work in bringing all of us together who passion for decent housing for all. So if we could just give a round of applause for Habitat for Humanity and the work they've done. I was recently reading an article and it highlighted how we spend 90% of our time indoors. Most of that time is in a house, in our home. And so this article went on to talk about how important a home is for economic development, education, and especially health. And within Habitat for Humanity, our focus is on how do we change family, a person's life to be able to be all that they intend to be. And I was recently, a few years ago actually, at a panel of doctors who were talking about the importance of housing. And one of the doctors was from Boston Children's Hospital in Massachusetts, actually my hometown. And she was talking about a child she was treating who was 5 years old, who had severe asthma. The reason why she was so debilitating, she could not go to school, it was affecting her outlook. It was because of where she lived. She lived in a home that was damp, that had mold, and it was affecting her. And so the doctor said, you know, I could treat her symptoms, but the only cure for that child is a decent place to live. And she said, the best vaccine against a disease is a safe and healthy home for children. And so that was just an indicator of how we are building homes, but we're also changing lives through the homes that are built. Habitat for Humanity has been helping millions of families with decent shelter for the last 47 years in more than 70 countries around the world. And I live in Bratislava, in Central and Eastern Europe. We focus on really 3 main pillars One is energy efficiency. The second is social housing, social rental, and empty spaces, creating housing stock and creating the financial model that it's affordable. And the third is vulnerable housing for Roma, elderly, people with disabilities. And so you'll hear more about those pillars, especially the work that Habitat for Humanity Poland is doing. Habitat's also involved in the Ukraine response, supporting families on the move here in Poland and throughout the border countries and now in Ukraine. We recently released a study by the Metropolitan Research Institute on the need for how we provide housing for refugees across Europe, and that's available in both English and Polish for you to resource. I talked about how housing is important for education and health. More importantly, it's important for a child to grow up where they can dream dreams and have hope. I've lived in Asia for 25 years, and I was at a dedication of a home in one of the countries, and the family was moving in. The home was not finished yet, but one of the children, the two children who were going to live in that home, took us on a tour of their home. It was not finished. There was no furniture. There was no kitchen yet. There was lots of cement on the floor. And the child began to talk about what life was going to be like in that home. There was a boy, he said, I'm going to sleep in this place. My sister's going to sleep over here. Obviously, her space was smaller than his. He said, this is where my mom is going to cook meals. He took us outside. He said, this is where we're going to plant flowers. And I think that's what we're all here to be about, is how do we help children like that to live in a decent place so that they can dream dreams. And so thank you for being here. Thank you for your passion for housing, whether you represent civil society or corporations or government, academia, you're all a part of the solution, and we look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Dzień dobry. Mieszkalnictwa w debacie publicznej, w dyskursie politycznym oraz wiele innych zmian. Nie będę poświęcała jakby całego mojego czasu na wymienianie tych zmian.
And the slides, please. Everyone, I'm very glad to be here today. And of course, I would like to start by thanking the organizing, giving me the opportunity to be here today and start this extremely important forum and discussion on housing in Poland, which is also relevant for many, many countries in Ukraine. And I will start my presentation looking at the housing crisis in Ukraine, as it's the issue currently has transborder character, because having a home or not having the one also influence transborder forced migration movement, and taking some historic similarities in development of urban planning and housing in Ukraine and Poland. I believe some recommendations and information will be also interesting for people from Poland here. I would like to start finding immense damage in Russian invasion of Ukraine caused. More than 1.5 million residential units has been destroyed, and third of them are completely destroyed and not repairable anymore. More than 6 million refugees from Ukraine currently residing in Europe and waiting their chance to be back to Ukraine. More than 5 million of IDPs currently in Ukraine, also in the need of home and stability. And this immense damage caused created one of unprecedented, or one of the biggest housing challenges in Europe nowadays. But the solutions to these challenges encounter systemic problems which are part of Ukrainian housing sphere. And a just short overview of Ukrainian context, as in Poland, Ukraine has been characterized by researchers as super home ownership housing, meaning that we have extremely high rate of debt-free home owners, and this is often towards the state housing, despite general trends of marketization. And of course, in Ukraine, it left questions of maintenance and land unresolved, which led to deterioration of housing stock. And this like focus on home ownership continues for many years. So most of the policy we had in our countries even directed towards support of home ownership. For instance, reduced rate mortgages, even though they were not so efficient, as only 41,000 households were supported by the State Fund for Support of Youth Housing since 1994, which is very little if you consider the size of the country. And there has been subsidies for electricity and heating bills and even reparations of housing. And even now, after the invasion, the government tries to solve housing crisis in Ukraine by introducing more mortgages, which are also difficult to scale up, and they have very limited results in terms of provision of housing. But at the other hand, the like rental market and social market, they have been completely out of attention of policymakers in Ukraine. So it's resulted in very low numbers of social housing around the countries. As you can see, it has been around 1,000 units in whole countries in 2021, and the rental market is fully unregulated and unsupported in Ukraine. And that's what it left us. Markets has been very limited for communities national governments to deal with. So we have been lacking policy instruments that would efficiently help us to resolve housing crisis. We have very little spatial planning and use the land instruments related to housing. We have lack of integrated social housing policies, lack of functioning maintenance and renovation, and what is also interesting, even lack of strategic documents related to housing. Um, resulted in very fragmentary housing and shelter solutions for displaced. So most of the displaced Ukraine, as in Poland, has been accommodated in rental housing market. Rental housing market very unprotected and price spikes are unpredictable. Like 30, at least 38% of people reported not having sufficient funds to pay for rental housing market, and there are many problems with discrimination and access towards rental housing market. And there has been very little support of renters from the government. It is difficult to access because only owners of apartments could get this, apply for this support. So those who cannot pay, they resulted to rely on patchwork short to mid-term solutions in Ukraine, so-called collective sites or shelters, which were created with great efforts and some success by NGOs and international organizations. And actually, according to my research and colleagues, many displaced people, they have even preference towards these places as they give more security than rental market. But of course, 90% of residents stay in collective accommodations. It's also indicated people don't have more permanent solution and treat these short-term accommodation solutions as a long-term option. So as you see, there is an urgent need to solve this issue, but there is no one solution, no simple way to solve it. So there is no one policy or one which will help alleviate the situation. So I would like also to present recommendations for systemic change developed by my colleagues from New Housing Policy and in cooperation with Netherlands Environment Assessment Agency, which you can also check in the report, Rebuilding a Place to Call Home. And I will just shortly present some of them. So what will we need? We would need to develop national framework and national strategy for housing in Ukraine, which we are missing. And this national strategy, it should also integrate clear guidelines for support of provision of housing for the vulnerable groups and also development of non-profit housing sector. And of course, this all cannot function without finance. So there is a great established executive body for the national housing policies in Ukraine, and that executive body should be responsible also for assessment and monitoring of the situation in the country. And establishment of funding body would also have like such a national housing fund, which would be responsible to finance this non-profit housing. What also important in terms of what happening now in Ukraine, generally upgrade tenancy rights in Ukraine as the tenants getting more and more prominence and rental sector is growing in Ukraine. So it's necessary to introduce at least some protection for renters and introduce mechanism of assessment of rental market and in general support for tenancy rights in the countries. And as we have still unresolved questions of housing stock management, there are some measures necessary to resolve that problem of responsibility of owners of multi-story apartments in multi-story buildings and their responsibility to upkeep this housing and of course to introduce energy efficiency into the issue of housing stock management. What is also missing is efficient land use planning in Ukraine. So we need to start thinking about housing in terms of its connection to land, because housing, it's not flying, it's the air. So we would need to have some new instruments which are like inclusionary zone, provide opportunities for socially oriented housing in the countries, and because there should be upgrade of municipal responsibilities, an increase in municipal capacities, because housing in developed in communities. So the community should have clear also strategies, what they do, how do they provide housing, but also clear capacities. And this all should be also done, of course, with in cooperation with civil society and all. Yes, thank you so much, and I will give words to my colleagues so she can help you to see more in Polish situation.
Thank you very much, Galina. Thank you very much for invitation. I'm really honored to be today with you. Maybe some quick introduction about our idea how to organize these keynote speeches. We talked with Galina about it to present two dialoguing presentations. I hope that we managed. So that's more on me in this task. First of all, I'd like to present you more. And now I can. Yeah, and I hope that our presentations will also correspond with each other and present you a comprehensive picture of housing conditions and challenges in Ukraine, which you already have seen in Galina's presentation, and more Polish in mind. And I would like to start with quick snapshot about Ukrainian situation, about refugees in from Ukraine in Poland. I think that that it could be perfect. That it could be real good to stop here for a while and to take into consideration the impact of refugees on housing market in Poland. And I think that this could be very interesting for you just to stop here for a while. So for now, for half of this year, we've got approximately 1 million of refugees from Ukraine here in Poland. And as we in the institute we tend to is the fourth one. It's very important. it's the most important information from this slide, not the numbers of people with UKR status in Poland, but this impact is not so big on the prices as we tend to see. And now I'd like to say a few more words about. I wish, but may I have another slide? Sorry. Okay. Thank you very much. So I don't want to present the whole context of the whole historical context of housing in Poland, but just few important issues, which are very corresponding with the presentation of Galina. As you see here, we had very similar structure of housing market, and we also had a very important shortage of housing. As you will see on the next slides, this shortage is not minimizing anyhow, maybe even raising. And what is interesting, the big, really high expenditures, public expenditures in 90s, we tend to think about low housing expenditures, public state expenditures in 90s and 20th century. But they were all really big, especially in comparison to current situation. And why, despite these high expenditures, we had really low investment in housing. I think that this one of the stereotypes that we have to fight against, because this state allocated funds were not so much limited, but the construction was not supported. Totally other fields of housing policy, mainly housing associations, not construction of apartments. And what we have to juxtapose this trend with is the situation at the beginning of 21st century, when the entry of people from 80s, same as me, on the housing market in 2004, 2008. And we see that the access to mortgage law and to secondary market was so low that the affordability of housing was very low, and there were also very limited access to social housing. The same problem as in Ukraine, as Galina presented already. And when we come back to current situation, to Poland in 2023, we see that we also have big problems with housing shortage. When we will do the same exercise as in one of the previous slides, we see that we still have big housing shortage of 2,300,000 apartments. It's enormous number, and it's also very differentiated regionally. And of course, we have also some problems with the distribution. I also want to highlight some numbers. Because when we have into consideration the numbers from national census data from 2021, we see that some of the communes already reached the one of the most important indicator. So people per 1,000 apartments, for 435 people per 1,000 apartments, but this particular communes have to struggle with population the population loss, high level of vacancies, and on the next slides I will show you all these challenges that communes in Poland have to face. And what are the main challenges? As I mentioned, housing deficit. They are very similar to the Ukrainian ones. Renovation gap, low standard of housing, poor housing conditions, not only in municipal stock but also in private stock, mainly tenement housing. Low availability of housing, demographic challenges, and also very limited connections between public and private sector. And as I mentioned before, some information about technical condition, about the technical conditions of housing resources in communes. We have enormous share of old stock, and it's mainly concentrated in municipal stock. As our moderator mentioned, I'm mainly focused on urban revitalization, and we perceive that in our urban revitalization areas, this problem is totally limiting the offer of housing. What is also important to see, this is a map of Poland, and here we see only buildings with poor condition, in poor condition, and this shows that mainly communes in Poland face this important challenge. And also one of the important challenges in housing stock, in municipal housing stock, is scale of vacancies, and it's also interconnected with this poor condition. And as we see, there are two competing problems. One is creation of new housing stock, and the second one is renovation, raising energy efficiency of buildings, and so on. And as we analyze the problem of investment, of housing investment in Poland, in communes in Poland, we see that the budget of communes are very limited, and concerning housing, only less than 5% of budgets allocated to renovation. What is the context of this problem? Housing privatization of housing stock, this very similar situation as Galina mentioned. So this housing stock is privatized to renters, and then they may not have resources for renovation, and also need additional support. And also insufficient rental rates, because communes don't have enough resources to renovate housing stock. And I don't want to mention all this changes. I think that there's these things that Katarzyna Przybylska already mentioned in the first welcome speech were very, very important, but I only want to highlight some of this, mainly create establishment of government housing development funds and support for social housing initiatives, which broaden the offer of housing, of social housing. And finally, I'd like to highlight some not recommendations, but some challenges and some important reforms to be introduced. And it's not prepared by me, but it comes from last week debate with Polish employers and Polish Association of Developer Companies, and I think that it's summarized the problems that are not only concentrated on communes problem, but also on housing market. And the most important, I think, that's increasing land availability, and this land use reform that is already taking place in Poland can result in changing of development paradigm, in land use policy, tending to more multifamily housing than to single family housing, which is one of the important challenges in Poland. But of course, there should be incentives for developers, but also for other and support for other actors, mainly to increase the availability of rental apartments. Thank you very much for your attention. And
Bardzo dziękuję za to niezwykłe.
Thank you very much for your interesting interventions, for the facts that we learned, and this will make it easier for us to join the panel that we have organized for you. We're going to discuss the housing situation in Poland with Polish and Ukrainian perspective. We're going to talk about similarities and differences. And the moderator will be Katarzyna Przybylska. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Minister Agnieszka Ścigaj to take a seat. Kevin Allen, representative of the UNHCR in Poland.
Panią Liwię
Livia Styp-Rekowska, Chief of Mission at the International Organization for Migration, IOM in Poland. Mirosława Keryk, Chair of the Board, Our Choice Foundation Ukrainian House. Tomasz Pactwa, Head of the Office of Social Projects at the capital city of Warsaw.
Tak, drodzy Państwo, mamy jedną drogę.
We have one small change in the panel. Unfortunately, the season of colds is upon us. So thank you to Tomasz Pactwa, who joined the panel to talk about the perspective of local government. He will not be able to be with us until the end, so I will ask him first, if you allow me, so that we can listen and learn about the perspective of cities. Now, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about, we want this opening session to give you a general overview of the housing situation in Poland. Situation that we already heard about quite a lot in the opening speeches. Now we're going to focus on the challenges
są wspólne dla osób,
that are
które
faced
mieszkają w
both by
Polsce,
people
które przyjechały z
living in
Ukrainy, ale
Poland,
też dla
those who've come
Polaków, Polek,
from Ukraine, but also
którzy
for
w Polsce
Poles who
mieszkają.
are living.
Podobną sesję, jak pewnie Państwo
here.
pamiętacie,
A
przeprowadziliśmy
similar
rok temu w
session,
czasie Forum
we
Mieszkaniowego
had last year,
2022. W bardzo podobnym
in
składzie
a very
rozmawialiśmy,
similar
skupiając
panel,
się na wsparciu dla osób z
focusing
Ukrainy,
on
wsparciu
support
przede
for
wszystkim mieszkaniowym.
persons from Ukraine,
Nie wiem, czy
housing
Państwo
support
pamiętacie
for
tą sesję tak dobrze jak ja, więc pozwolę sobie
refugees from
nieco
Ukraine. I don't know
przypomnieć,
if you
co mówiliśmy
recall
rok
this
temu.
session. Let me remind
Zastanowimy
you
się
what we
potem,
said
co
last
udało
year,
się
and we'll
zrealizować przez ten
consider
rok,
what was
co jeszcze
possible
przed
to
nami.
achieve and what still lies ahead of us.
Więc rozmawialiśmy
We
o
talked
tej
about
pierwszej
this
odpowiedzi,
first
pierwszych działaniach,
response,
które
first
były
actions
podejmowane
that
w
were
Polsce w
taken
odpowiedzi
in
na
Poland in
potrzeby i
response to
wyzwania,
the
z
needs
którymi
and
borykały
challenges
się
faced
osoby, które
by
przyjechały z
people
Ukrainy.
coming from Ukraine.
Mówiliśmy o rozwiązaniach
We
polegających na
talked about
gości.
solutions such as basically welcoming Ukrainians by Polish households, the need for long-term solutions and integration strategies. We also talked about big housing centers. And experts said that people should not be housed at such centers for too long, because staying in this center does not offer the possibility of integrating, looking after yourself. This is just a temporary solution. We also talked about the challenges related to the fact that people incoming from Ukraine were mainly going to the biggest cities in Poland, to the metropolises, and that there was a big burden for the cities. We talked about a need for a revision of the housing policy, about the need for solutions that would respond to the needs of Poles, but also migrant communities in the country. We talked about the need to engage the refugee community about new solutions, intersectoral communication, cooperation, and preparations for the winter. So I'm looking forward to finding out what we managed to do over the last 12 months. We also had a survey, a public opinion poll, and we asked in this opinion poll about how the situation changed, the housing situation over the last 2 years. And we heard that the housing situation of 23% of Poles and 32% of people from Ukraine has deteriorated over the last 2 years. That's one of the challenges that we're still facing, and we're looking for solutions. For a vast majority of the people, the deterioration was a result of increasing costs of housing. That was the answer selected by 85% of Poles and 68% of persons from Ukraine that we polled. In addition, persons from Ukraine pointed to the fact that the worsening of the situation was a result of the fact that they moved into a lower standard apartment, or they had to add more people to the same size of apartment. So overcrowding, in other words, was a problem. Moreover, Poles pointed out to the key challenges that we're struggling with is the lack of opportunities to carry out refurbishment, heating costs, and a lack of opportunities for changing the apartment of house for a better one. In the case of Ukrainians, the problems were somewhat different. They were not feeling comfortable. There was no privacy. They were not able to live independently, and it was not possible to change the apartment for a better one with higher standards corresponding to the needs. We are all facing challenges, as we can see, but there are different shades
sobą.
to the
Także
problem.
jestem
There
bardzo
are differences
ciekawa,
between
co
these groups.
paneliści będą
So
mieli
I'm
do
looking
powiedzenia
forward
na
to
ten
finding
temat.
out what the panelists are going
Dlatego,
to
tak
say
jak
about
mówiłam,
it.
porozmawiamy o tym, co się
So
udało
we're going to talk
osiągnąć
about
i
what
gdzie
we managed to
powinniśmy
achieve
stawiać
and
priorytety na
what
przyszły
are the
rok.
priorities for
Ja
next
ze
year.
swojej strony nie będę za dużo
I will
mówiła o
not
tym, co
talk
udało
too
się
much
osiągnąć i
about
jak
what
widzę
we
ten
managed
mijający rok.
to achieve and how I see the
Ale
passing
to, na co
year.
chciałam
But
zwrócić
what
uwagę,
I
to, że
wanted to
rzeczywiście
point
ten
out
temat
is
poszukiwania
the fact
rozwiązań
that looking for
długoterminowych
long-term solutions
towarzyszył nam w tym roku.
has
Na
been
przykład warto
on the
zwrócić
table.
uwagę na pilotaż
The
wzajemnie
pilot
potrzebni,
projects
działania, które w
wzajemnie
ramach tego pilotażu
potrzebni,
zostały podjęte przez panią minister.
municipality
Tutaj właśnie
needed.
te pierwsze
This
społeczne
is
agencje
the
najmu, które
first
powstają w
social
Polsce
rental
w
agencies
związku
are
z
being
pilotażem.
established as a result of the pilot project.
Trwające prace
The work
nad
that is ongoing on
strategicznymi
the
działaniami
strategic
długofalowymi,
long-term
wdrożeniem
actions,
całego
the
programu.
implementation
To
of
są bardzo
a
ważne kierunki, na
continuous
które warto
development
zwrócić
program
uwagę.
are
Dużo też
key
mówi się w tym
directions.
roku,
We also
robi się
keep
w kierunku
hearing, and
wykorzystywania
we see
pustostaniów
done
na cele mieszkaniowe.
in using
Też jest
vacant
komponentem pilotażu.
apartments
Ale
for
też
housing.
szerzej wydaje się,
That's
że
part of the pilot project as well, but there's also a more extensive
temat wykorzystywania
topic.
pustostanów
Using empty
naprawdę nam
houses
towarzyszył w
has
tym
gained
roku.
prominence over the last 12
Większość z
months.
dzisiejszych
Most
panelistów,
of our
organizacji,
panelists
które reprezentują,
together
niestrudzenie działa
have
na
been
rzecz osób
working
uchodźców i
tirelessly
migranckich,
to
na rzecz osób z
address the
Ukrainy,
needs
które
of
teraz
refugees,
znalazły
migrants,
bezpieczne
people from
schronienie w
Ukraine
Polsce.
who found a safe haven in
Kwestie
Poland.
zakwaterowania i
The topic
mieszkalnictwa
of
są
housing
szalenie istotne,
are
dlatego żeby
critical
zapewnić możliwość integracji.
to make sure
Także
that
rok,
these
który
communities can
upłynął od
integrate.
ubiegłego forum,
The
przyniósł
last
wiele
12
zmian.
months have brought many changes in this respect.
Ukrainy nie jest
Model of
popularny. Wiele punktów
Ukrainians
zbiorowego
staying with
zakwaterowania
Polish
jest
families
zamykanych.
has changed.
Poszukiwane są rozwiązania średnio-
Long-term
i
and mid-term
długoterminowe.
solutions are being sought.
Także ostatnie już słowo z mojej
And
strony.
the last
Chciałabym oddać
statement,
głos
I would
przede
like to
wszystkim
pass
naszym
the floor to our
panelistom.
panelists.
Raport, o którym
The
Rick wspomniał w
report that
swoim
Rick
głosie
mentioned
otwierającym,
in
czyli
his
rozwiązania
opening
długoterminowe
statement,
dla osób z
long-term
Ukrainy,
solutions for persons from Ukraine, parts of
w Polsce zostały przetłumaczone na polski
this
i
report have been translated into Polish, and I'd like to focus on several recommendations from this report. First of all, the recommendation is to draft a national strategy for
Tworzenie bardziej
integration of
równomiernego
refugees,
systemu rozmieszczenia, w
create a
ramach
more
którego istnieją
even system
zachęty do
of
poszukiwania
placement of
innych miejsc
people
do
to
zamieszkania,
incentivize them to
innych
look
poza
other
dużymi
places
miastami, ale
outside of
takich,
big
w
cities
których jest
to live
dostęp
in,
do
where they would
miejsc pracy,
still
do
have
dobrej jakości
access to
edukacji,
good
do
quality
placówek,
education, to
do
jobs, to
systemu po prostu
healthcare
pomocy
and
społecznej.
social assistance, social
I
security
trzecią taką istotną rekomendacją jest
centers.
właśnie
And the
zwiększenie
third
podaży
recommendation
tanich
is
mieszkań
to
w miastach. I tutaj
increase the
wskazuje się
supply of
kilka
cheap
możliwych
apartments,
kierunków,
cheap
jak to
housing in
zrobić.
cities. And there are a
Wykorzystanie
number of suggestions
istniejących
here. First of all,
pustostanów,
using
umożliwienie
available
organizacjom
empty houses,
pozarządowym zakładania
available
społecznych agencji najmu,
entities,
uruchomienie programów
establishment
remontu
of
i
social
podnajem,
rental
żeby
agencies,
mobilizować istniejące zasoby i
facilitating
wykorzystywać je na rynku
upgrades to
mieszkaniowym.
existing housing
Także
stock.
nie przedłużając
Not to
wstępu,
take any more of your time,
oddam głos
I would like to pass
naszym
the floor to our
panelistom
panelists.
i pozwolę sobie zacząć
And
od
let
pytania
me
pani
start with a
minister
question
o to,
to
jakie są
the
najbardziej
minister.
imponujące i istotne sukcesy
What
w
are
ciągu
the
ostatniego
main
roku
successes of the
oraz
last 12
najpilniejsze
months, and what
wyzwania,
are the most
które przed nami
pressing
stoją
needs, most pressing
właśnie w
challenges
zakresie
in
mieszkalnictwa,
terms of
integracji
housing
osób
and
i grup
integration
znajdujących się w
of
trudnej
persons
sytuacji.
in a difficult situation?
Dzień dobry, witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie.
Good morning.
Dziękuję za
Thank you
zaproszenie.
very much for invitation. The 12 months have passed pretty quickly, and still we managed to do some things. Kasia asked about the most spectacular achievements, what we managed to do. From my own perspective and from the perspective of the government, I can say that in the housing policy, over 1 year, you cannot have any spectacular successes. The process takes a long time, and you've been talking about it for years. Improving the housing situation in Poland takes years. It's not an area where you get spectacular breakthroughs. I have listed the successes, but it's still insufficient. We still have a lot to talk about, and we still need to do a lot. In terms of the housing needs of Poles and Ukrainians who are among us, I will not talk about the differences between the things we're doing for Poles and for Ukrainians, because over the last time I was trying to convince many people that they've been with us. They are here to stay, and they should be benefiting from all the services on a regular basis. And that's what the integration policy focuses on. What is available for Poles should be available to Ukrainians, people who are here, who are among the community. And we've had some success. When you look at the worst cases, the stays in big housing centers, I think we got that down to a level where we can deal with it in cooperation with local authorities. We have less than 26,000 people living in big housing centers. These centers are being closed down because there's no demand for them. That's a plus. Secondly, where these people are moving to, this is the migration movement. We see from the support that is being paid out that there are many aspects, and you can't say that with one move you can change many things. There was a pilot project that Kasia talked about. It's been a successful pilot project. Even the success was somewhat overwhelming. There's a lot of need.
Uczestniczących w seminariach.
There were many participants willing to take part in such pilot project, but we will be establishing social rental agencies across the country. At the end of November, we're going to have another call for 100 million zlotys, so a bigger reach. And I hope that around 50 social rental agencies will be established. So far, we have just 5 during the pilot project. And that's what I'd like to focus on. Rental housing, because social rental agencies are nothing new. They've been with us for 2 years, but they've not been functioning. In many other countries, they are faring pretty well. They are account for 30–40% of the rental market. They are affordable, and they're a tool for local governments to diversify housing policy. Social rental agencies can address the issue of vacancies, empty houses that can be adapted for regular housing. They can also use private stock, because the Statistics Office published information that we have 1.8 million empty houses that are not available for rental because of poor technical condition or for other legal circumstances, or a lack of tool to manage this stock remotely when someone is living abroad and they own an empty apartment. So there are many aspects here. Social rental agencies have not been popular in Poland. Thanks to the pilot project, thanks to the cooperation with Habitat and other organizations represented at the table, international organizations, we amended the legislation. And an important improvement is that these social rental agencies have been fine-tuned. For example, social rental agencies have been given the possibility of providing various housing-related services to local government. This is a key change, even in the context of the deinstitutionalization, looking for supported housing, all sorts of supported housing. The terminology is not consistent here in Polish. Housing for senior citizens, for people with disabilities, people who need support, or migrants who need additional services related to social inclusion, integration. Childcare, care for dependents, teaching the language, or assistance in the labor market. So this is a breakthrough, a big change in social rental agency legislation. Social rental agencies have already preferences someone who's offering their apartment doesn't pay for tax, for example. So this decreases the money, the higher payments. I know I'm talking too much here and taking too much time, but anyway, changes to the legislation. There's another big change, is that social rental agencies can use the funds of the BGK, the National Bank, National Infrastructure Bank, and they can use funds on the same principles as local authorities to raise the standard of housing. I hope that this will result in the fact that local governments will get a good partner and a good tool to expand their housing stocks for rental.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Well, thank you very much. And right now a question to Director Tomasz Pactwa. What is the impact on the efficient social policy? How important are housing services? How are cities supporting people who are at a difficult moment in time? Well, thank you very much. And hello. Before I answer this question, let me say that in order to respond to the current situation from the perspective of the government, we are affected by budgetary changes. Last year, the reality that I'm going to present to you, that's the reality we knew last year and in previous periods when we were planning budgets for local governments. And right now, to tie or loose ends in our budget, well, the city had to borrow 2 billion zlotys to close the budget for the next year. So the situation is truly dramatic. So refurbishment of the apartment is one thing, but to prevent homelessness, prevention schemes, well, we need to have our own budget. We cannot plan activities from central budget, and we need to durably support different schemes to prevent homelessness in longer time frames. And right now, our financial capabilities have shrunk dramatically. About 200 million were missing in next year's budget. I mean, I do apologize for this introduction, but it's a very important issue which is taking its toll on refurbishment and purchase of apartments. We are creating the housing policy of the city together with Michał Zburzak, who is the head of department at our office. I will have to leave this conference, but Michał will answer your questions. I would like to focus on Housing First program. That's a program that I've learned for the very first time a decade ago as a member and an employee of the town council. And I thought to myself, are we going to give apartments away for free? But then we conducted research into homelessness. We were focusing on people who are successfully fighting homelessness. We dwelled into factors that motivated people to fight homelessness. And we have identified in our research that people who are staying at shelters have lower chances to fight homelessness because they're not integrating with the society. And several years ago, we received Housing First funds, and together with Wrocław and Gdańsk, we launched a program in cooperation with Brother Alberto's association. So we have tested in our cities how effective is current legislation and what is the difference in the cost of supporting people in sheltered, in supported housing and in shelters. So we are converting empty apartments, we are renovating them, and chances for budget for such causes are very high, and we have identified that we need approximately 20 million zlotys a year to fight homelessness. Well, if you transpose those figures on the national level, and it's fair to say nearly 10% of people who are homeless live in Warsaw. And those investments generate value added, and you can effectively solve the problem in some cities. For example, in Wrocław, costs are higher because you need to rent apartments on the free market, but we are almost there. It's a strategic decision that needs to be taken on the national level together with local government units. Do we want to solve this issue or not? Because we are able to do that. And we are focusing heavily. I'm working on a team affiliated with the European Commission. For example, there is a pilot program implemented in Finland, which is successfully fighting homelessness. We have about 75 apartments right now. We had 10 when we were launching the program. We want to have 200. We can afford 50. We are refurbishing apartments in collaboration with Habitat, for what we are very grateful, and also in cooperation with the private sector. Key costs are the costs of assisted housing. When we were launching Housing First program, we have noted that those people are later being integrated. They still need sheltered housing. When we are looking after the homeless, we need to look after them over the entire period, of course, less intensely later than at the beginning. And we wanted to adopt a resolution on the social housing agency, but unfortunately, politics came into play and the current governor repealed the motion. Other cities have succeeded, we did not. Unfortunately, I have to mention politics, although I'm not in a good position because I work for the town council, but it's counterproductive. Of course, we have a program for housing development and a plan that we would like to implement for people with disabilities, for parents of children with disabilities, to provide target apartments. And we have started cooperation with the Social Housing Association. There are two agencies like this operating in Warsaw, because we want to select social partners, and together we are going to plan construction of apartments designed for specific people. We have the first organization that will be selected this year. So in 2 years' time, we'll start building apartments for selected people. And Kasia said right at the beginning about collective accommodation centers for refugees in Warsaw, which became home to more than 5,000 people. Right now, in several shelters, we have several hundred people who are struggling on the labor market, but you can see how effective we are. You know, people are living on their own, but still there are 800 people living in collective accommodation centers, and these are last places in Warsaw like that. So that's everything from me in a nutshell. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, because you'll be leaving us shortly. I will give the audience time for questions. I know that it's not a standard practice, but if you have any questions, please ask now.
Justyna Krzykotowska.
Justyna Krzykotowska. I'm a mother of a child with disabilities and an author of numerous books about housing. I'm an assistant professor at Łazarski University. And together with other parents of children with disabilities, we have managed to build. Oh, it's Parliament Television calling me. We have managed to build Poland's first house for orphans with disabilities. And what you've said, that including parents in this program is incredibly effective, because we had a record time. I established the foundation together with my husband when foundations could be established in Poland, because obviously it was not possible in the times of socialist Poland. And I'm very happy to hear that we have such program in place in Poland, thanks to international cooperation. And my question is, are you trying to encourage Poles living abroad to join the program? Because, for example, architects from Berlin, born in Poland, provided us with a blueprint, and they have many more experiences, and they were very helpful. Thanks to them, we were able to complete the project in such a short time, especially that their Western experience was very interesting. The West has done a lot for people with disabilities, contrary to Poland. So cooperation is all important. Cooperation on a wide scale, Poles with experience, because then we would not need to have interpreters, and international cooperation. That's extremely important. So thank you very much, because we are here in such competent company, and I hope it's going to help us make a major step forward. So please, do remember that international cooperation is important. By the way, I'm the vice chairperson of the International Congress of Expatriate Polish Community, if you need help. We have a social dialogue committee, and yes, we are meeting with different NGOs. These are working discussions, very intense nevertheless. And funding, we have obtained funding thanks to a subsidy from Bank Gospodarstwa Krajowego. And we need to provide a certain number of apartments for people with disabilities. This is how we build our business model. Without going into details, NGOs may obtain such apartments for very little money. We need to provide a certain number of such apartments, so it's beneficial for everyone, and we can build something. And as far as availability is concerned, things are definitely better in Poland. We have experts who have know-how, who know how to build apartments for people with disabilities. They can take part in international discussions. So I'm encouraging everyone to join our committee. So we've heard about activities implemented on the national level, on the municipal level, and right now I would like to focus on UNHCR.
Ukraine refugee response in Poland evolved over the last year. What is the remaining scale and the type of needs, housing and also other needs, and how can this be addressed?
Great. Thanks very much, Kasia, and thanks, Rishana. Thank Rick for organizing this with the larger Habitat team. I'll be very frank at the outset. I approach this topic with a great deal of humility. being in Poland, a highly developed country, being in the European Union, because most places where the UN refugee works on shelter, we're literally talking about bamboo, wire, plastic sheeting, maybe zinc roofing. In my last experience in a big operation, I was in the largest refugee camp in the world in Bangladesh, but completely different than the housing context here. That said, we've learned a lot from our friends at Habitat, also from Minister Chigai and the great work that she's been doing. And we've had a lot of interactions in the last year also with international finance institutions and with private banks. And part of what I'll talk about in my intervention is a few areas where I think we could explore further. And I was very happy to hear, Kasia, that this afternoon, there'll also be a segment on the private sector and the way that they can complement the fantastic initiatives that are emerging from the government. But maybe first, I'll build a little bit on Galina's presentation, which gave us a cross-border perspective, Ukraine and Poland. And of course, as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, we will focus on the refugee element. But I want to be very clear that our approach to this issue is one that would also include low-income Poles who need housing. We can't just focus on the refugee element. That's part of it, but it's only part of it. I'm also here with my colleague Olivia from the International Organization for Migration. We know that Poland for the last 5 years has given more foreign worker visas than any EU member state. So you have Ukrainians and other migrants and other refugees of other nationalities who also may need affordable housing so that they can contribute to Polish economy. They're here, they're paying taxes, they're making contributions, but like low-income Poles, they need affordable housing. So just to step back briefly and look at the global picture, we know that currently there are 5 million people internally displaced within Ukraine. That's approximately the size of Ireland. So an entire EU member state displaced within Ukraine. At the same time, 40% of the Ukrainian population is in need of critical humanitarian aid. On this side of the border, we know that Poland has received in the last year almost 5 million people through its border. Now, many of them moved further west, but if you think about that figure, that could be the size of Norway, that quantity of people crossing the border. And currently there are 6 million refugees in Europe. So if you want to take another country's population, that's the size of Denmark. You have an entire middle-sized country who have been forced to seek refuge inside Europe. Now, as Galina shared with us and Alexandra, this is, added to an already complex situation in Ukraine, but also in Poland. Although I was very glad to hear, Alexandra, that you cited the statistic that the arrival of Ukrainians, contrary to popular perception, has not really contributed that much to the rise in housing price. It's more an issue of supply and demand, and we're struggling on the supply side, I think, and inflation. When you look at the situation going ahead, it's very unclear how things will evolve in Ukraine. There's 3 key strategic directions that UNHCR and all of the different partners, including our sister UN agencies and UN agencies, are working on. And they boil down to 3 key things. Number 1, making sure that people continue to have access to asylum, to international protection. Some of you will have seen that the Council of the EU has recently endorsed the extension of the Temporary Protection Directive through March of 2025. So that's strategic priority number 1. Number 2 is really looking out for the most vulnerable amongst us. And we've heard friends from the audience mention disabled people. This is one category of people who may slip through the cracks, notwithstanding the exemplary response of the government of Poland and the people of Poland to this situation. The third area that we're looking at together is socioeconomic inclusion. Now that includes lots of different things, including getting jobs, accessing financial tools, financial inclusion, credit refugees, but it also includes housing. And this is perhaps the most daunting task that we face as the UN Refugee Agency. Now, we've heard from Kasia a number of the opportunities and great practices. Of course, Minister Chigai's pilot project is maybe the flagship of really trying to show how the social rental agency scheme can work in practice. Something I was very glad to hear also is that the National Infrastructure Bank, BGK, may now be able to facilitate some funding for these SRAs, which I think is a key thing. How do you fund these mechanisms in a sustainable way? I also heard from your presentation, I think, Alexandra, that of course the government has offered first-time home buyers low interest mortgages. This is at 2%. Of course, the problem with that is if you don't have increased supply of housing stock, it just drives the prices up even further, which is what we're seeing. So what I really want to just focus on briefly, and then I'll conclude and hand it over to my colleagues, is this part of supply. So we know there's a lot of demand. There's a lot of need for housing from low-income Poles, from many refugees, from a number of migrants. The statistics are clear, and Alexandra gave a very nice overview of that. But the part I want to focus on in my concluding remarks now is supply. Now, it is true that the social rental agency scheme and initiatives that the government is undertaking are critically important. And part of that includes what our friend from the city of Warsaw was referencing, which is social housing, which requires budget. And this can often be very complex in any country. But what I really want to focus on is low-income housing. So not public housing, but housing that generates a profit. And in that context, I want to talk about public-private partnership. Now, this is not an area that I am an expert in, but one of the things that we try to do as UNHCR is to play a catalytic role to maybe link up different actors who can come together to address complicated problems. And in this context, we think there is a lot of potential for the private sector to play a role, and perhaps a leading role in increasing housing stock. Now, there are different ways that this can occur. One is, of course, through tax incentives or tax breaks. This goes way beyond my ability. This is a matter for government policy. Another aspect, if you talk to institutional investors in Poland, private investors who are there to make a profit, whether they're talking about commercial or residential real estate, one of the elements that can make it an attractive package with current interest rates and building costs is the donation of land by municipalities, for example. So that is one element of how things could be structured. But another thing that I just want to flag is we should not forget that there are international finance institutions who have a socially focused role to help people who are poor or who are marginalized. And I think we need to explore further how potentially international financial institutions, and I won't name them here because I don't want to put them on the spot, but we're having discussions with some of the big ones, and there's some interesting stuff percolating, I will tell you that. But how do we pair them with private banks, but also with cities? Because if you look at, for example, the World Bank in the international financial institution system, they have a very difficult time providing low interest loans to Poland because it's a government that's developed. It's a country that's developed. It's the EU. But there are other parts of the international financial institution system who can facilitate and structure deals with private banks, with cities, but also with the central government to incentivize more construction of fresh housing stock on the one hand, but on the other hand, in Poland, we know we have a lot of vacant housing stock that needs to be refurbished. So I can't say much more on this, but I'm very glad that there are smart people in the room who can, and I'm sure many of you in the audience know about these things much more deeply than I do. But I just want to say that in addition to being very excited and encouraged by the Social Rental Agency and the work of Minister Chigai, I'm also excited about the prospect of public-private partnership.
Thank you, Kevin. And now over to Livia. What are the particular challenges faced by the refugees from Ukraine in relation to housing and accommodation in Poland?
Thank you very much, and likewise from my end, thank you so much for inviting IOM to be part of this conference and to be a part of this distinguished channel. First of all, I would like to also comment a bit on the global picture, because having worked on with Habitat, with UNHCR, all colleagues, with Minister Chigai on the issue of housing, especially in the last year and a half, I really started paying attention to housing that pop up in different newspapers and articles. And I really must say, I always smile when I see a picture, an article in The Economist or on BBC talking about the housing crisis in Los Angeles, housing crisis in the UK, housing crisis in Wellington, in New Zealand. So it's a topic that is not just, of course, it's heavily focused. We're heavily focused on it in Poland, given the situation here. But it's a challenge that governments and administration and public-private sector are dealing with in really many countries around the world for different reasons. I also want to pick up on something that Rick mentioned in his opening speech, because recently I saw a TEDx talk by a 10-year-old girl, and she spoke very eloquently about what kind of environment she as a child wants from parents, and she advised parents to create for their children. And it was not about buying gadgets, it was not about doing this or that. The very first thing she said, we as children want to have a healthy and safe home. That was, and she repeated it over and over again, and that's exactly what you said. So I think that we really sort of have to keep in mind the big objective and the big picture when talking about challenges and solutions, and including talking about it from the perspective of children, for whom, of course, are very much concerned, especially in the current refugee situation. Building on the very excellent presentation at the beginning on the housing shortage in Poland, I don't think I have to repeat that indeed one of the challenges that are faced by refugees is the limited pre-existing social housing, but limited number of employment and the supply that you mentioned, Kevin, in general. And recently we have, as a humanitarian community, completed the multi-sector national needs assessment. And we know from these surveys that indeed most refugees actually live in a flat. But there is quite a significant number of refugees who are still living in collective shelters. And while the living in a separate accommodation is great, that they have managed and they are able to support themselves to pay this rent, our, of course, great concern still the vulnerable families and individuals who live in the collective shelters. And there's a separate discussions ongoing on how to have some sort of an exit strategy or a plan, long-term plan for these collective shelters in particular. Now, IOM and Habitat co-lead the shelter sector and the refugee response plan. And we discussed and we had a plan with all the participating organizations, a number of activities and solutions, both immediate and mid to long term. And indeed, some of these are being implemented, including through the bilateral project IOM and Habitat are implementing, focused on cash for rent, rental deposit support, renovation of empty spaces, renovation of apartments, and distribution of supplies, so non-food items or supplies, to make sure that these apartments become safe and healthy spaces to occupy, to become homes, not just houses, as Rick said in his opening remarks. But it's true that that the social rental housing agencies that has been so discussed here, and this is something that we're also working on with Habitat and so successfully under Mr. Chigai's leadership as well, is really something that Poland hopefully will further evolve. As you mentioned, Minister, there is plenty of experience elsewhere in EU, and I do know that Poland has looked into these experiences elsewhere in the EU. So it is only my hope that this particular scheme and approach will be further scale up to assist the vulnerables. Now, the one thing that I do want to elaborate on is, as I mentioned, the collective shelters, where we see that this is where indeed some of the most vulnerable families are staying. And the reasons for this are various. Either they, for whatever reason, cannot work. Very often this is due to the fact that they have to be carers for others, not just children, but also elderly. The percentage of families, and this is again coming from the multi-sectoral needs assessment, the percentage of families with an elderly, so above 60 years old, is higher, much higher actually, of those living in collective shelters than those living in rented housing. So it does show that perhaps this is a consideration, and this is an impact and an aspect. We also know that the lack of knowledge of Polish language is an issue because with the language barrier, refugees are very unable to negotiate the terms of the contracts, don't understand perhaps what is being offered and required. Obviously, the issue of income that I mentioned, insufficient income to pay the deposit to start with, and to be able to have sufficient income to and reliable income to pay on a monthly basis. Because one thing that we also see is that all of a sudden, if a family is hit with a medical bill, unexpected medical bill, or any other expenses, paying rent obviously becomes a problem. The other thing is that, as was rightly mentioned, and as we observe, the collective shelters are slowly being closed. But this also means, and while there are objective reasons for it, for example, the dwindling numbers or perhaps other considerations, what it really means for the family staying there is that after sometimes months, sometimes longer living there, and we do know that, again, from the needs assessment survey, that I think over 40% of those who are living in collective shelters now have stayed there for 6 months or longer. It means that after all this time that they have got to know the local community, attended local schools, found a job locally, found some friends, all of a sudden they have to be moved to a completely different shelter, somewhere completely else, sometimes different, not even a different district within the city, completely different city altogether, which means that that the sense of uprooting again becomes, of course, a great issue for the family and a great challenge for the integration aspects and success. Here, I would also like to quote one staggering statistics that I came across, and I think it's a lesson for all of us humanitarians working on raising awareness among what options are, not just on housing, it's on schools, it's on access to healthcare, on other things. According to the latest survey, the multi-sectoral needs analysis, needs assessment, 64% of the Ukrainian refugees didn't know where to look for information on access to services, and that includes housing. And 39% did not know which source to trust. So considering how many different avenues there are for getting this information, from being starting with the government, of course, but all of us here at the table, organizations, municipality, NGO networks. I come across on a regular basis a new source of information on legal stay, on access to work, done by different actors, and yet 64% of refugees say they don't know where to look for the information, and 39% say don't know which source to trust. So I think that we have some work to do, perhaps collectively, on streamlining the information that is available to this group, to make sure that they really access the right thing in the language they understand, in the form they understand, and to facilitate it for those who most need it. Thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much. Now, Miroslava, what are the key mechanisms for integration of Ukrainians in Poland? We heard about education. The minister talked about access to services. I think that was something that featured in every intervention. If you could tell us from your perspective, what has to be taken into consideration? Thank you very much for invitation. I have already lost some points from my list that I have drawn up, but I will still like to talk about it. I would like to tell you more about what we are doing, what we consider is worth doing. As the Ukrainian home, we have a holistic approach to supporting Ukrainian migrants and refugees. We treat humans as humans who need housing, jobs, education, language skills, cultural needs. They have the need for community psychological support. So this is a comprehensive approach. I talk about education, not just in terms of language, but also education for children. So this is a complex approach that is particularly relevant in the context of housing. As Minister Ścigaj talked about the relocation program, this is something that can be difficult for people who are coming, and they have to change their location once they entered a community. They found a school for the kid, they found a job, even if they're not making enough money to support themselves, but still they have some community. They are in a place, and it's difficult to uproot them and move them elsewhere, even if the housing conditions would be better or living standards would be better elsewhere. So what I'd like to focus on is, it was in your Habitat report as well. Housing and jobs are particularly important. The fact that someone cannot find housing in a place where they have a good job to enable a dignified life, that's something that restricts people in improving their living standards. When we're talking about Ukrainian refugees, not migrants, migrants are people who came earlier and they know their way around. Refugees are usually mothers with children, senior citizens, or people with disabilities. And for them, it is very difficult to find a well-paid job to support their housing and family. This is a codependency that creates a vicious circle. You find one, but you cannot find the other, and vice versa. You get a good job, but you don't have an apartment because it's very expensive, etc. And that's very important. Then you have the location, which is key, because big cities, well, I think I'm talking about obvious things. We all keep saying it, but I think it's still worth saying it. Availability of housing, availability of support from migrant organizations, NGOs, and public services. There's more of it all in big cities. We are working with the Mazowsza, the Warsaw region, with the support of UNHCR. We're cooperating with organizations in the Mazowsza region. We can see when these refugees have no community support. There's a lot of stereotypes in smaller towns. You have neighbors who don't really know much about you, about your situation. There's a lack of understanding. There's a lot of negative stereotypes in smaller towns and villages. So that's something that we need to focus on, working on big cities and small town to build mutual trust, working on the level of big cities and small towns. Libraries, public institutions, they need to be proactive. They need to try to reach Ukrainian communities to try and do various things. There's a lack of awareness on both sides. Ukrainians may not know that a library can have an offer for them. And the operations of this or that institution apply to them, and they can go and find support. We had a conference about entrepreneurship about women. This was a conference organized in Warsaw, and what we found out that refugees were not aware of the fact that various support programs of the municipality authorities are available to them as well. The communication channels were not right. Another thing, let me emphasize again, organizations like ours, community organizations, where it's easier to come because you can talk to people who come from your culture. They can show you and they can communicate in your language. You can feel at home. That is important, to be able to feel at home even when you're abroad. This gives you a sense of security, stability. This is something that's very precious for refugees escaping wars. This is not just a situation of Ukrainian refugees. It's important for every community to be able to get support from your own people. And culture is very important. We tend to forget about it. An example of our actions, when the full-scale invasion started, we got people who were looking for food, housing, clothing, basic things. But what they were also asking about whether you have a library. We need books for us, for our children. We need to fill time. That was part of our crisis response. We created a library. That was very important for the people. This affords the people dignity. They have access to culture. Another thing is, I think we can talk about it later, and we get the opportunity to tell you more about it. And that ties in somewhat to the electoral situation. I cannot refrain from the upcoming elections. The topic of migrants and refugees is present in the electoral campaign, not in the right way. It's a dehumanizing context. And unfortunately, it means that when we are talking about combating stereotypes or building social cohesion, inclusion of people from a different culture, different ethnic background into the community at local level, the topic of migrants and refugees during the electoral campaign is not helpful. It basically pushes us back along this route. And we as NGOs cannot tackle that problem, even though we're trying everything that we can.
And last very individual thing, so preventing homelessness as it comes to migrants or refugees, personalized approach is really important. So, for example, we have a social package. We are providing social support to people. So when we have men visiting us, because very often we talk about homeless women, but there are also men who lose their jobs, who lose apartments. whose documents are no longer valid, Ukrainian documents, and they are living in shelters. So first of all, we would need to help them find a job, temporary accommodation, because those specific people should have time to apply for new documents, which cost money, to get a job and later extend his stay to be here legally. So we've had one case like this. It took us a month to get out the men from homelessness, and very often this support is important, not to, or prevention of homelessness is important, especially as it comes to migrants and refugees. Thank you very much for the first round of questions. We have managed to touch on many important issues, and we have discussed the need to have shared policy, to have shared activities that include all most vulnerable people. We have mentioned social rental agencies and seeking for new models that would include the private sector. We've mentioned supply, the needs of the most vulnerable people, needs of people with low income or low income households, and affordable housing that responds to their needs. What we have mentioned to achieve this year, changed figures for collective accommodation centers, issues related to relocation. We've said a lot about access to information. We have stressed that information must be fit for the needs of people who are in need of information. These are people who do not know how to communicate with authorities, so information needs to be adequate and embrace needs of people. So these are issues tackled in part one, but I have several other questions addressed to you. Well, first of all, Madam Minister, what are most important programs and housing measures that would support people in risk of social exclusion? What is the key, in your opinion, to widen up access to housing for those people, for those groups? Like I've mentioned before, different groups have very different housing needs, and we need to have customized programs tailored to individual needs, because I've said it before, perhaps this message didn't resonate well enough. We have very varied programs in place that support various needs. There are programs for people who would like to have one day their own flat. Of course, war, inflation have made interest rates balloon, and young people are struggling to buy new apartments. So we have 2% interest rate for mortgages. You can also start saving money for your own apartment when you're a child, and you have very friendly mortgage rates. You can also build a small house up to 70 square meters without any permits. And we are supporting local government units because they may get back 80 or even 90% of reimbursement of costs of social housing. For example, council flats, when they are refurbished, we are reimbursing the expenses. We have 31,000 council flats built in recent years. And of course, local government units have an important role to play because they are providing land, etc. And local governments need to submit for funding, and we are also supporting financially refurbishment of social housing. You have asked me about most vulnerable groups, for example, people with disabilities. We have earmarked several million zlotys last year for housing adapted to their needs. It's going to be sheltered housing, and it's an alternative for care homes. People with disabilities are able to live on their own. So we have a scheme, but it's going to be an ecosystemic solution in the future. Our programs, for example, are also implemented to provide sheltered housing or assisted housing. We are no longer building care homes. We are now focusing on individual flats. What we need is a special purpose act on assistance for people with disabilities, and it's probably going to be adopted next year as part of a systemic solution. Social rental agencies, I'm not going to discuss them any further, but it's another alternative for local government units. I don't know why this resolution was repealed in Warsaw. In most cities where our program was implemented, such agencies are being established. In Dąbrowa Górnicza, it was a challenge. I know that it's a new solution within the Polish frameworks. We don't have any local references. The only examples are from Western Europe or overseas. Private apartments will be eligible for subsidies from the Polish Infrastructure Bank. 50,000 flats are now being built. There are different initiatives supported by local government units, and there will be building houses and apartments for rental built to very high standards. So as you can see, we have a very wide range of different activities, and public-private partnership mentioned by Alan. You know, this is something we're trying to introduce in Poland step by step, because, for example, renting private apartments, you know, is a step forward as well. The act on PPT, for example, we are struggling with providing land for private investors. I mean, we will need to work on it further, because we need to build a system for supervision, because it is space that needs to be efficiently overseen and monitored in case of any possible incompliances, but I think we will be able to fix this problem soon. For example, I have listed other programs that are being put in place to boost the energy efficiency of our housing. So we have a very wide range of different initiatives, depending on what is needed where. Together with Habitat, we are introducing amendments to Polish legislation. A new act on housing cooperatives will be adopted. For example, a group of people can together build a multi-story house, or so there are many new additions, many new elements, and you need to keep in mind that everyone is important, because the government is not going to start building apartments. Local governments are not operating in void. So what is needed is cooperation. For example, social rental agencies that were established as part of pilot implementation, it's an NGO. and private apartment owners. They are working together. The effectiveness of their cooperation is higher than we've expected. This afternoon, we are taking stock of the program, and we will thank local government units and players who took up this daunting challenge and will become an example in the years to follow.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, there are many changes underway, and I think we are heading towards intersectoral cooperation, and this is something we should be focusing on because no sector alone is going to solve such complex challenge like housing issues. Livia.
Ukraine in Poland, living in collective centers improved over the last year. What are the most significant changes that you observed in relation to this particular demographic group? We talked about lowering the number of people in those collective sites and closing some of the sites, but what about the people who are still staying there?
Thank you very much for this question. First of all, it's a bit difficult to address this question because what we see in Poland is a huge difference in the standards in collective shelters. And just off the top of my head, of the shelters that I personally visited over the past year and a half, if I compare a shelter in Kidałowice, for example, in Podkarpacie, and many of the shelters in Warsaw, for example, in Wołoska or Rondo NZ or even Kaszprzaka, it's a very, very vast array of standards that we see in the shelters. This is why I think it's very important that we work with the shelter managers managing these shelters. And we have a very nice capacity building initiative, IOM, UNHCR, and the Danish Refugee Council, precisely working with those managing these shelters, these coordinators, to make sure that they share lessons and experiences amongst themselves and to the extent possible follow certain standards. Because the truth is that Poland has to learn very, very fast in the past year and a half when it comes to shelter management and these collective shelters, I mean. And when you do speak to the shelter coordinators, they will tell you that they come from everywhere. I mean, there are artists, there are journalists, there are lawyers, there are social workers. They have done all sorts of things before they have become shelter managers, and many of them, vast majority of them, that really, really excellent job. And I think it's really very important that this expertise that has been built in the management of these collective shelters is really caught and built upon for the future. Now, speaking specifically about any improvements in the shelters, I would like to go back to data because we actually do have data on this in terms of what the improvements were in the collective shelters. One of them that is quoted by the residents is more privacy. So I think that in the beginning, when it was important to find any shelter, and you know very well that a lot of the collective shelters are in unused office buildings, for example, and elsewhere. So over the past year and a half, there has been a steady effort and consistent efforts to make sure that there is separation for the families living there. So one is more privacy. The second one cited is better access to on-site healthcare. And this is by a consistent effort to make sure that there are doctors, very often also specialists, not being present permanently at the sites, but coming to these shelters on a regular basis. We did have shelters, for example, where there was a medical point established there on a permanent basis, open all the time and accessible all the time, but most of the time is a doctor visiting, so access to healthcare. And the third one was frequency and quality of meals. And again, this is an effort that has been consistent in many of the shelters that we have seen. So there are definitely some improvements, and we have data to back it up. But again, I want to go back to what I mentioned in the very first point, is that very often those residing in these shelters are very particular groups. As I mentioned, I think over 50% of those residing there have an elderly in their family. So it's and for sure, access to healthcare would be one of the aspects that could be deciding on why they continue living in the shelter. Also, then pointing to the fact that living in the collective shelter becomes almost a necessity, or rather than a genuine choice to stay there. I would also like to mention, because we spoke about vulnerable groups, it's not only persons with disabilities, but also the minorities. And IOM works very, very closely with the Roma community in Poland. All of you work on the housing aspect, so you know very well that the Roma families face extraordinary discrimination and extraordinary barrier to becoming accepted even in the collective shelters, let alone in private accommodation. For Ukrainians, again, according to the data that we have, 12% cited discrimination of accessing private housing. I don't have the data for the Roma population, but I can assure you that it's way, way, way higher. So, so I do want to mention that there are very particular groups, and Roma population being one of them, that face exorbitant challenges in accessing decent housing, either in a shelter or let alone in private accommodation. Now, and going back to your question in terms of the relocations and the collective shelters, I do think that there has to be a strategy or a plan in place, and that it cannot be just a matter of whom we move where, but it has to come with quite a comprehensive analysis and comprehensive plan in terms of what is there, what else is there for those families who would be potentially moving. Do they have access to jobs? Are there kindergartens? Are there schools? What else? What other services will they have available? So I think any changes to the collective shelters have to come with a plan. And just as we discussed previously, that it has to be consulted, I think, with children. Well, for sure, it has to be consulted with the refugees themselves, because so that their opinions, their preferences are taken into account, and that it has to be very clearly communicated, so that it's not a rushed plan, rushed decision. We are closing this shelter because we no longer have funds to support it, or whatever, and then it becomes a challenge, not just for the refugees themselves and for the authorities, but also all of us who are really trying our best to help and make sure that the process is done as organized and as possible. And last but not least, I really cannot emphasize enough the link to labor market inclusion and social inclusion that I mentioned again previously. In IOM, we have been running what we call an info line for many years. And this is colleagues who are on the phone every day, dedicated to answer inquiries from anyone who calls us. And this is not just refugees, it's also migrants, of course, who have been here or who have come here even since the outbreak of the war. It's also employers calling us to inquire about the current laws on employing migrant workers, etc. So it's an info line that is available to anyone who has any interest on the migration legal framework in Poland and so on. And I can tell you that for us, the info line has been a very good pulse of what is happening in the refugee community, because each time a shelter closes, we see an uptick of calls. You know, we are being moved. What options do we have? How can we access this? So, so I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to make sure that each time there are changes in this area, this is clearly communicated to the refugees, but it also comes with a much more comprehensive plan that goes beyond just moving someone from one plan to another. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mira, a jak z twojej perspektywy
Mira, and from your perspective, what can you tell us about the needs of people from Ukraine, those needs that you see day to day, which are of those needs are still unaddressed? Let me just add to what Livia has said, because we have a hotline as well. And I have some facts and figures. In May and August, we had more than 1,600 consultations on the hotline, inquiries about accommodation. So this is just the hotline. I'm not mentioning, other places where inquiries may be made. Okay, so let me reiterate what remains a challenge for refugees from Ukraine. We have 40 plus for new arrivals. This is the program that has been put in place, and later, unfortunately, things don't get any better with housing when after 3 months, even if you get a job, it won't pay your rent. And because there is no support for people who have taken in Ukrainians, it's very difficult to find free of charge accommodation, and those people cannot afford to pay the rent. So this is something that you've highlighted in your report. No privacy in apartments. People are renting apartments together, several families. What is taking a huge toll on education of children? 50% of Ukrainian children are schooled online. And the quality of online schooling is average when you are sharing your room with another family. So, all those problems are related to lack of support after 3 months. We were all hoping that the war would end after 3 months, but we are into the second year of the war and we have no end in sight.
Another thing that applies to senior citizens and people with disabilities, the difference here is that the senior citizens, 60% of people who come to us are people who don't have a support system. They don't have a family, they are alone, and they're no longer able to work. So they also have all the problems associated with old age. They need to be looked after, they need support, and we see that that is particularly needed. And support means financing. The people who are able to work, they are financing in a way the senior citizens from Ukraine, because those who are in employment, they are paying all the social security payments, they are paying taxes. So this is some money that could be used to provide support. We need an inclusion strategy, and I nod at the minister here. We need to address the problem of social inclusion. I hope that it will be possible. Now, available housing for single mothers, a big challenge. The legislation provides protection for single mothers. That's why owners of apartments don't want to rent out to single mothers with many kids. That's a big problem that we come across when we are trying to find apartments for such families. And on the one hand, you have a single mother with children. She's also a foreigner. She comes from a different country. And there's also the problem of anxiety, apprehension. We often hear, we will not rent out to Ukrainians. So this is a cross discrimination in terms of the labor market. Another thing is something that the minister has been trying to address. I mean, the attempt at relocation and providing holistic support so that migrant or refugee families would move to smaller towns, because in Warsaw and big cities, there's overcrowding in big cities, basically. That's why we would like to have some people moved. Overcrowding means that families have to live together in a single apartment, and that's an issue. Another issue is the access to social housing and affordability of housing. When you're talking about Ukrainian women refugees, they often work below their qualifications, earning less money, whereabouts the minimum wage, and it's very difficult for them to find affordable housing. They're in this gap where they're not entitled to any social security support. They're making money, but they're not making enough to be able to afford housing. And something that applies more to refugees than Poles who make less money. People, the owners of apartments, demand a deposit that is higher for Ukrainians than for Poles. So that's not just the problem of people being able to afford their monthly rent, but they have to put a lot of money up front to pay the deposit. The deposit can be 3 times the monthly payment, for example. That's basically something that's impossible for these families to pay. Now there's a need for support in finding housing. Social rental agencies are an option, but we are also trying to help. Basically, it's about calling around, calling people, walking. There's a language barrier for people to go and see houses. You need legal support. You need to check the contracts to make sure that the contract is fair for both parties, not just for one, so that both parties can feel safe. We currently have 34 people a week who are receiving this kind of support here in Warsaw. So certainly this kind of service is something that is useful for both parties, the owners and the tenants. We also need an insurance program for apartment owners in terms of timeliness of payments to address the issue of lack of willingness to rent out to foreigners, so that owners would be willing to rent out to foreigners without fearing that they will not be getting their money. I think that's it for now, and I will speak later if I have the opportunity. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Next, what should be our goals for next year to ensure that refugees in Poland are well supported? What are the most relevant initiatives or changes that you think are needed?
Well, I'm not sure I'm smart enough to answer that question. And I may just recap some of what my distinguished colleagues referenced. On the housing front itself, I really do think that we need to exploit all the possibilities on the public side and on the private sector side, and then the two together, public-private partnerships. I think one thing I hope is that Minister Chigai continues in her current role, and she's been such a strong advocate for the social rental agency. And it's also quite noteworthy that these 5 pilot projects have a really nice linkage between the central government, straight from the Prime Minister's office, down to the Powiat Gmina level, very grassroots. So I think that's a great practice with a lot of potential to continue developing. The whole issue of social housing goes beyond my expertise or pay grade. It's more one for government policy. We do know that the private sector, and if you talk about investors from institutional funds, see huge potential in Poland. The business fundamentals for investing here with such high demand and such low supply is great. And there is an increasing level of activity in the private sector, including from institutional investors, not just from Poland, but from other EU member states. I'm thinking most notably of certain investment funds from Germany, Austria, and France. And the reason for that is because it's the business fundamentals are there. They can make money. Unfortunately, much of that focus will be on middle income to upper income housing. Of course, that alleviates some pressure in the market. So I think it's still good that the market works its magic. But ultimately, to address the people we're most concerned about, low-income Poles, some categories of migrants and refugees, there really needs to be that public-private partnership. And so I hope that in the discussions that continue to evolve, we have, of course, the central government and municipalities engaged and leading on the policy front, but also have international finance institutions, private banks, institutional investors, contractors, the people who actually build the construction companies, to understand what would work for them in terms of incentives. And we probably need some smart real estate lawyers involved in those types of discussions. Certainly, you'll need people smarter than me, because I don't understand all of the nuances, especially in Poland. But the other thing, in addition to housing, that I would highlight is socioeconomic inclusion. Livia, Minister Chigai, Mira have all mentioned this. You know, for the Ukrainian refugee element in particular, we know that many are working and contributing to Polish society. They're paying taxes. We also know that a number of people are underemployed, and they have a hard time bridging the rent gap between, you know, qualifying for social housing on the one hand and being able to actually get into an apartment on the other hand. So I think as much as we can continue to do to help people get jobs, the better. And of course, in Poland, with such low unemployment, and the Polish government, you know, really rather exceptionally, if you look at the global picture, exceptionally giving people the right to work. This is, you know, happening throughout Europe, but I don't take that for granted as an official of the UN Refugee Agency, because most places where we work, people can't legally work, or it's very difficult for them. So this is a huge advantage. And I can only commend the great work that IOM, Ukrainian House, and other NGO partners are doing to help refugees get jobs. Another thing I just want to flag, and this would be the last thing, is financial inclusion. What do I mean by that? Access to credit, to loans. This is also very important. We know last year, one of the highest percentages of new businesses started were Ukrainians, actually. They're very entrepreneurial. And so in addition to finding jobs, helping to facilitate credit, and it could be, you know, relatively small credit sometimes for small businesses, can make a real difference. I don't fully understand the mortgage system here, and I don't know for sure that all Ukrainian refugees would want to buy, because we do know that at least 70% of them in our surveys still want to go home. But they may want to start a business in the meantime. And I can tell you there's been some exciting things happening on this front. And I'll give you just one example. The International Finance Corporation, the IFC, recently announced a very interesting initiative with a private bank, with Banco Santander, which has a robust presence in Poland, to facilitate up to $100 million of low interest credit for Ukrainian refugees. Below the market rate, the IFC essentially comes in and offsets the normal interest rates to make it cheaper to get that access to credit. So I think financial inclusion, socioeconomic inclusion, and all of the great things that are happening on the housing front need to continue. And I just would, I guess, make the overarching comment that we should make sure that we include the private sector in that. Because from my vantage point, and perhaps I say this in part because in the past I worked in the private sector, they are often the ones that really have the ability to drive things when it comes to supply, to really increasing supply. And so I hope that in the discussions that continue, there'll be more discussion by people who understand these things better than I do on public-private partnerships and really kind of formulating some of the options that exist. Because I think we should be ambitious. I think we should go as big as we can on this to really try to make an impact, not just for Ukrainian refugees, but for Poles who need housing as well. But on that note, I just want to really thank Minister Chigai one more time for all of the great work that she's done in really catalyzing a lot of this. We're very fortunate to have a minister who is so inclusive and progressive herself on these issues. So thank you also, Minister Chigai.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much. And I think we'll proceed with questions and answers because we have quarter of an hour left. I know we have questions from participants who are joining us online. So let's start with those questions. Later, we'll have questions from the floor. I don't know if you've noticed what is happening on the flip chart. We have a lady who is taking notes in the form of drawings, all conclusions from our discussions. Those drawings will be mailed to you in electronic format after the end of our conference. I'm delighted, to see those drawings. So take a closer look when this session ends. And right now, over to our online participants who are asking questions. Are we going to see those questions on the screen?
Dobrze, to może, żeby troszkę przyspieszyć.
Okay, so to speed things up, I'll start reading questions because I have them on my phone. Question 1, Joanna Talewicz, the head of Stronę Dialogu Foundation, supporting people from the Roma community. A question about the vulnerable, and what about people who are living in poverty. There are many Roma families in such situation. They are still living at collective accommodation centers. There are also families which are independent financially, but cannot rent a flat because they are told we are not going to rent out flats to people from the Roma community.
This is to Lenny.
Thank you very much. This is a very important question. And as I mentioned, we are working very closely with the Roma National Council on supporting the Roma population. And I completely agree with all the challenges that were mentioned in the question, because we see that as well. One thing that I have seen work, and this is thinking of specific Roma families, for example, that we have supporting, because a lot of the work with the Roma population is about casework. It's family by family, individual by individual, and one thing that I have seen work is very specific and individual referral. because I'm not. I completely agree that it's very difficult, and the challenges are definitely there. The discrimination is definitely there. By the way, not only in Poland, as I'm sure you know, the Roma population is present in certainly in this part of Europe. I come from Slovakia, so we have a Roma community in Slovakia as well, but so is in Czechia, so is in Hungary, and so it's not a challenge that is faced by the Roma population here in Poland. But what I have seen and what we are working on with the Roma Council is individual referral. Unfortunately, there is no magic bullet to fix it right away. As you know very well, there are currently dedicated shelters in Poland only for Roma refugees, because this is what has been possible. They have not been, very often they have not been accepted in other collective shelters, and very often the only way how to have them in a collective shelter to start with is to have a collective shelter on just on its own. I'm not saying that it's an ideal situation, but this is what we have. But what we do see is that individual referrals, so finding apartments where some of the families can relocate, and it can happen, and it does happen, is I see a slow step-by-step strategy that can work on the immediate basis. But I completely agree that this is a wider question that will require much bigger and much more comprehensive solutions. Thank you.
Ja trochę chcę uzupełnić.
And let me just supplement this statement, and let's make it clear, integration of Roma communities, not only the Roma community from Ukraine and also from Poland. And I remember in the past, I used to work for social services in Poland, and I know how difficult it is. I know how many programs we've had, which were implemented by local governments, and those programs were failing for many different reasons. I'm not going to list all of them. If you are familiar with this community, which is very distrustful, it's very distrustful to everyone who is coming from the outside with ready-to-use solutions, with housing solutions. I know very specific examples from the region of Małopolska. The local governments have built estates for Roma community, but integration failed. Of course, lessons were learned. And what Livia said, cooperation with the Roma community, with members of the community. For example, a Roma family has registered recently to have foster children from other Roma families. So it's a progress, but we need people from this community who know how Roma families operate. So whenever we offer something, whenever we suggest something, and of course they're not excluded from programs implemented by the central or local government units, they're entitled to be a part of them. But we need to build relations, individual relations with those families, and that's hard. That's why we need those cross-cultural educators who are familiar or come from the Roma community. And there are, dire shortages, but there are more people like this. This organization, which asked the question, is one of them. So it's a long way, and there is no one successful recipe. Traditional solutions didn't really work in the past. And one more question, Madam Minister, it's to you. So will implemented programs be put in place in large cities? If yes, how big? it's a question about the social housing agencies. Okay, so yes, to the first part of the question, social rental agencies will be implemented in larger cities. So the pilot project was addressed to smaller towns with population less than 150,000 inhabitants. So right now, also larger cities will be able to take part. So social rental agencies will be established in larger cities, and the service component will be very important. This component will be partially funded from the European Social Fund and partially from the National Infrastructure Bank. For example, funding to adopt the apartment will be paid with subsidies, and the European Social Fund is paying for social services. So that's why we will be combining refurbishment with social services. Apartments, eligible apartments will also include private apartments. And it's up to proposals, it's up to our creativity and of course the group of beneficiaries, because we will need to adapt services provided within the scheme accordingly. The catalogue of services is very long. So, for example, supporting support on the labor market, mental or psychological counseling for families, or support for people who are dependent in a wide sense. So it's up to authors of different projects to suggest different solutions. We will be designing customized services that fit different beneficiary groups. That's what we are going to evaluate as part of the project. Thank you very much. And last several minutes, we have questions from the floor. Yes, we have one question here, and later you and you.
Move to English, yes. Not a question, but rather a comment to what you said. You talked about the necessity of the public-private partnership, and that it would maybe be good to offer incentives such as giving lands from the state properties, etc. But I'm wondering if you're aware that since 2016, in Poland, there was a very ambitious project, which was called Mieszkanie Plus, Apartment Plus, which was supposed to be just that, offering different incentives. There was a number of amendments made to existing laws, a number of instruments made to encourage private developers to work together to receive lands like this from the state treasury, etc., and to build rent-regulated housing. And this was a much more ambitious program than something like SAN that we're talking about. But everybody here who's Polish knows that this was a disaster, and even the government admitted it and closed it down. So what I'm just thinking is that when people keep talking about this idea, this idea hasn't, was along for decades here. And I understand why you think this is a great idea, because of course, in many countries, this exists and it functions very well. But in Poland, it didn't work out. So rather than, keep going forward with less ambitious plans, I think what a discussion really should be is what happened to Mieszkanie Plus? Why did it fail? And not only fail, it failed miserably, right? And everybody knows it. So yes, this is just one thing I'd like to consider for housing people to think about in the future. If you are talking about public-private partnership as a model forward, what conclusions can we draw from this failure? Thank you.
Thank you all the presenters for your excellent presentations. My name is Alexandre Corriveau-Bourque. I'm from Verent Solutions. I think the common theme across all of your presentations is that there is a tremendous need, but there's also a massive financing gap to address all the priorities: supply, ensuring that there's adequate and robust ecosystem of supports, and rehabilitating dilapidated units and making them sort of adequate and affordable again. Considering that sort of government debt has been skyrocketing for the past few years due to COVID and rising interest rates, meaning that an increasingly significant amount of government resources are going to debt servicing rather than going to addressing sort of the housing crisis. To what extent are there sort of more innovative funding instruments, maybe such as debt swaps that have been extensively used in the conservation sector, being considered to address some of this financing gap in Poland and other places? Thank you.
Dziękujemy bardzo za to pytanie.
Well, thank you very much for this question, Kevin.
I'm really not to speak too much, so I'll make some brief remarks, but maybe just to the first colleague who intervened, you, I'm sure, know much better than I do the context in Poland and the possibilities of public-private partnership and some of the things that have not worked in the past. So my only hope would be that people who are smarter than me can really assess those things and assess different options. One thing that I think may not have been part of the equation before is international finance, institutions who were involved, who could contribute funding, not for concessional financing, but for low interest financing to facilitate much lower interest rates to build. I think there is potential for that. We've certainly seen it work in other places, but you would need to talk to experts at places like the IFC, for example, who have a better grasp of some of those dynamics. But what seems fairly clear to me as an amateur in this area is something has to be done, because the current supply situation is really not good. And I personally struggle to see how in most countries, at least in Europe, state-only interventions have succeeded. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know, and this is up for debate. In terms of debt swaps or different incentives to I guess to incentivize building, I would probably defer to others on the panel who know much more about this than I do. But I know that one of the things that the finance institutions like the International Finance Corporation look at are different ways to structure financing. So some of that can include funding that will lower interest rates or offset them, to provide incentives, debt ratio incentives, things that I don't fully understand, but which other people probably understand better. Another aspect, which I haven't heard mentioned today, but which I know is relevant in the United States and other places, is bond issuances. For example, municipal bonds to raise revenue. In some countries, there is an interest in social bonds, not just to potentially raise revenue for housing projects, but also for childcare, which is something that relates to economic inclusion, as we discussed earlier. But just to be clear, most of you who are listening and who dedicate yourselves to this issue, I'm sure have much more expertise than I do. I'm just suggesting that there seems to be potential, at least to assess further with public-private partnerships.
Jeżeli mogę dopowiedzieć.
Well, if I may add to what Kevin has said and what you have said about Mieszkanie Plus. Well, the housing policy, its key element is diversification of funding. And I do agree, seeking for models, combining different sources of financing is essential to effectively support the housing policy. I have mentioned a number of initiatives implemented on very different level, and they have the apartment and service component. Mieszkanie Plus was in the fact a financial model that has brought together private entities, central government and local government units, and it did not play right. For example, social housing agencies or loans for social housing, this looks much better. I mean, this instrument works and is effective. There was an act on PPP, which implied that local government units would provide land and private investors would build houses. We still need to think about monitoring and supervision, because this is the key in such projects, because we can't have a situation, the human factor is all important. Very often we are combining private business, which is not about, charity work. They are there to earn money, and the state may use land, but to pursue its social goals. So reconciling those objectives is very difficult, and something was not right. There are areas where it was effective. Mieszkanie Plus wasn't one of them. And we are not saying that some models we are now testing, for example, social housing agencies, we know that, tweaks are essential, that we need to improve the model further. That's why I'm listening very attentively when you discuss different models that work in other countries. It's not always possible to transplant them to Poland, because we have very different legislation. They need to be adapted to very specific Polish conditions, and there's nothing wrong in drawing conclusions from failures. We are getting more and more diversified. For example, the number of apartments per 1,000 population has gone up by 12%. So things are improving. Ever since 1979, we've had thousands and thousands of new flats being built. So solutions and seeking for new models is effective. What we need is robust legislation that enables introduction of new solutions that are tried and tested elsewhere. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are behind our schedule and we need to wrap up our session. Okay, so please be very short. Madam Minister, and I have a question asked as a graduate of a course in housing economy at Łazarski University. Well, guidelines were published by other governments, and we want to expand them. And I can see that you are the alpha and omega in this area. Is it likely that those guidelines will change? Because we would like to add something. I know that you will have a debate with all candidates, a debate dedicated to the role of housing in their programs. I know that Konfederacja, Krystyna Krzakotowska, I will be representing Konfederację, if you can add me to the list.
Chodzi o program studiów, tak?
Your question was about the program of the course? No, the government program. Okay, I'm competent, but not that competent. I need to check it and I'll get back to you. I'm not familiar with legislation. But we'll stay in touch.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Okay, so thank you very much. I would like to thank all our panelists. We had a very exciting discussions. My 3 takeaways are development of what we've managed to achieve, seeking for new solutions, and integration, holistic approach, and seeking for solutions that are engaging for all players. So I'm not going to give you the floor to recap, but discussions continue today and tomorrow. What Kevin has mentioned, including the private and the public sector in development of the housing sector. We are going to have another discussion this afternoon. This afternoon, we are going to discuss situation of Ukrainians on the housing market. We have representatives of local government units. We'll be discussing international experience and energy efficiency, energy poverty. Topics are going to be discussed tomorrow, and Marcin is going to tell you about what's coming up next.
Bardzo dziękujemy wszystkim panelistom.
Well, I would like to thank all panelists for this very exciting opening session. So like you've heard, this is not the end. We are only embarking on our journey. Temperature will be only going up just like outside. And if you are thirsty, we are going to take a short coffee break, but we would like to take this opportunity. We have so many people interested in housing in this room. So please make the most of this time to build new partnerships, to be able to discuss new partnerships. We have arranged a number of tables while the coffee break lasts, and these are thematic tables. So we also have a simple game, and we know how it is when you get stuck with the same topic. So we'll be letting you know every 10 minutes. So if you want to swap table and get an insight into another topic, we will be discussing the situation of refugees in Poland, housing shortage in Poland, statistics Poland, what indicators are key for the housing sector, circular economy, and housing, sheltered housing and accommodation sector. And all those tables are for you while the coffee break lasts until 2 p.m. We have our resto store, which is giving second life to furniture, and you can talk to employees of our social rental agency in the corridor. And from 3 p.m. lunch will be served, and you are invited, because if you're hungry for knowledge, you need to boost your batteries to join us after lunch.